His maid's toddler waited every day at the gate. The reason was shocking. Alexander Thornton had built an empire on precision, cold calculations, and an impenetrable wall around his heart. At 34, he commanded boardrooms with a single glance, made millions with a signature, and lived in a penthouse that overlooked the city like a throne room. But the mansion he'd inherited from his grandmother sat on the outskirts, a sprawling estate he visited only when the silence of success became too deafening. He'd hired Mrs. Elena Reyes 6 months ago, a quiet, hard-working woman with calloused hands and eyes that held stories she'd never tell. She cleaned his floors until they gleamed, prepared meals he barely touched, and asked for nothing beyond her modest salary. What he hadn't bargained for was the little shadow that came with her. Lily, 3 years old, with tangled dark curls that caught the afternoon light and eyes the color of warm honey. She appeared every day at exactly 4:47 p.m., small hands gripping the iron bars of the estate's front gate, her face pressed between them as she waited for her mother's shift to end. The first time Alexander noticed her, he was leaving for a late meeting. His driver had paused at the gate, and there she was, a tiny figure in a faded yellow dress, standing on tiptoes, humming a melody he couldn't quite place. "Sir, the child has been here for the past hour," his driver mentioned hesitantly. Alexander glanced at his watch. Elena's shift ended at 6. It was barely 5. "Is she safe there?" he asked, his tone clipped. "She never leaves that spot, sir. Every day, same time." Alexander looked back at the small figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Something uncomfortable twisted in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name and didn't want to examine. He turned back to his phone, dismissing the feeling. But the next day, at 4:47 p.m., he found himself glancing toward the front windows. There she was again, faithful as the sunset, her small form silhouetted against the golden light. This time, she was singing. He could see her mouth moving, her whole body swaying to some internal rhythm. "Elena," he called to his maid the following morning, his voice carefully neutral. "Your daughter waits at the gate." Elena's hands stilled on the countertop, her knuckles whitening. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thornton. I'll arrange for someone to watch her. Please, I need this job." "I'm not firing you," he interrupted, surprised by the fear in her eyes. "I'm merely observing. Why doesn't she wait inside? It's cold out there." Elena's shoulders relaxed slightly, though tension still lined her face. "Lily doesn't like to be where she's not invited, sir. She says the gate is the in-between place. Not quite inside, not quite outside. She feels she belongs there." The answer troubled him more than it should have. What kind of life had taught a 3-year-old that she didn't belong inside? That afternoon, Alexander did something he'd never done before. He left to study at 4:45 p.m. and walked to the front gate himself. Lily was already there, 2 minutes early, arranging small stones in a careful pattern on the ground. She looked up when his shadow fell across her work, and for a moment, their eyes met. Hers held no fear, no judgment, only a curious innocence that made his carefully constructed armor feel suddenly transparent. "Hello," she said simply, as if greeting a billionaire was as natural as greeting the birds. "Hello," he heard himself reply, crouching down to her level, something he'd never done for anyone. "What are you building?" "A castle," she announced proudly, pointing to her arrangement of pebbles and twigs. "For the lonely king who lives in the big house. Mama says he has everything but smiles very little. I think he needs a castle outside so he can remember how to play." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Out of the mouths of babes," his grandmother used to say. He stared at this child who had somehow seen through walls that had taken him decades to build. "Why do you wait here every day?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Because Mama's inside," Lily said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And when you love someone, you wait. You don't leave. Even if it's cold. Even if it's long. You just wait." Alexander stood abruptly, unsettled by the simplicity of her wisdom. He walked back to the house without another word, but her statement echoed in his mind for hours. When you love someone, you wait. He'd spent his entire adult life running, from his parents' toxic marriage, from his grandmother's death, from any emotion that threatened to slow him down. He'd convinced himself that independence was strength, that needing no one made him invincible. But this child, with her patient vigil and her stone castles, had somehow exposed the lie he'd been living. That night, he stood at his window watching the gate long after Elena and Lily had gone. The small pile of stones remained, a tiny monument to faithfulness he'd forgotten existed. And for the first time in years, Alexander Thornton felt the hairline crack of something breaking inside his chest, the first fissure in a wall he'd thought was permanent. He didn't know it yet, but the girl at the gate had just begun a siege that would bring his empire of solitude crumbling down. The next morning, Alexander did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He took breakfast in the sunroom instead of his study. It just happened to overlook the front gate. Elena noticed immediately. Her eyes widened slightly as she poured his coffee, and he could see her calculating, worrying. He wanted to tell her she had nothing to fear, but he wasn't sure that was true. He didn't know what he was doing. "Elena," he said as she turned to leave. "Does Lily eat lunch?" The question clearly caught her off guard. "Sir? Your daughter. Does she eat while she waits?" Elena's jaw tightened. "I pack her small snack, Mr. Thornton. She's well cared for, I promise you. If her presence disturbs you—" "It doesn't disturb me," he said, then paused, searching for words that felt foreign on his tongue. "I simply noticed she's there for several hours. Send her inside tomorrow. She can wait in the kitchen. It's warmer." Elena's eyes glistened with something that looked dangerously close to tears. "Thank you, sir. That's very kind, but Lily is particular. She won't come in unless you invite her yourself. She has rules about these things. She says people's spaces are sacred." Alexander's coffee suddenly tasted bitter. "She's 3 years old. Who taught her that?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her father was a hard man, Mr. Thornton. Before he left us, Lily learned early to make herself small, to not be a bother. It's taken me a year to get her to even sing out loud again." The revelation settled over him like a weight. He thought of his own father, cold, critical, impossible to please. He'd been 10 when he learned to bury his feelings. This child had learned it too. "I see," was all he said, but his mind was already working. At 4:30 p.m., Alexander did something that would have shocked his board of directors. He put on a coat and walked out to the gate early. Lily was approaching from the bus stop where Elena dropped her after preschool, her small backpack bouncing with each step. When she saw him standing at the gate, she stopped, her expression uncertain. "Hello, Lily," he called out. "I've been thinking about your castle." She moved closer cautiously, like a butterfly approaching a flower. "You remembered?" "I remember," he said, and found that it was true. He remembered every detail of their brief conversation. "I was wondering if you'd like to build it somewhere more comfortable. Perhaps on the terrace? There's a table there, and the stones are smoother." "But that's inside," Lily said, her small brow furrowing. "I'm not invited inside." Alexander knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level once more. "Lily Reyes, I would like to formally invite you to wait for your mother on the terrace. You may build as many castles as you wish. Does that sound acceptable?" Her eyes went wide, and then a smile broke across her face like sunrise, pure, unguarded joy that he felt echo somewhere in his own chest. "Really, truly," she whispered. "Really, truly," he confirmed, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. She slipped her small hand into his without hesitation, and Alexander felt something shift fundamentally in his universe. Her hand was so small, so trusting, so warm against his palm that had signed contracts worth billions, but had never held anything so precious. He led her to the terrace, acutely aware of Elena watching from the kitchen window, her hand pressed to her mouth. He pretended not to notice the tears streaming down her face. "Now then," he said, settling into a chair he'd never sat in before. "Tell me about this castle. What does a lonely king need?" Lily settled cross-legged on the terrace floor, already gathering the smooth decorative stones from the garden border. "Towers," she said seriously, "for seeing far away. And windows, lots of windows so the light gets in. Mama says light chases away the shadows in your heart." Alexander watched her small hands work with intense concentration and found himself drawn into her world. "What else?" "A garden," she continued, placing small leaves as tiny trees. "Because beautiful things remind you that the world is good, even when you're sad. And a bridge, see, right here so people can come visit. Because nobody should be lonely, even kings." "Especially kings," Alexander murmured, more to himself than to her. They worked in silence for a while, her building and him watching, asking occasional questions. She explained each addition with the seriousness of an architect, and he found himself genuinely interested in her tiny world of stones and leaves and imagination. "Mr. Alex?" she said suddenly. She'd apparently decided Alexander was too long. "Yes." "Why are you lonely?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that he couldn't deflect it. Children, he was learning, had a way of cutting through pretense like a knife through silk. "I suppose," he said slowly, "because I thought being alone was easier than being hurt." Lily looked up at him with those honey-colored eyes that saw too much. "But alone hurts too," she said simply. "Different, but still hurts. Mama told me that. Your mother is a wise woman." "She cries sometimes," Lily said, returning to her castle. "At night, when she thinks I'm sleeping. But I wait with her, even though she doesn't know. Because when you love someone, you wait. Even if it's sad. Even if it's dark." Alexander felt his throat tighten. This child who had known hardship, he could only imagine, had somehow retained a capacity for love that humbled him. She'd been abandoned by her father, likely lived in poverty, waited hours each day just for a glimpse of her working mother, and yet she spoke of love with the certainty of someone who never doubted it. "You're very brave, Lily," he said quietly. She smiled at him, and in that smile, he saw something he'd forgotten existed: hope, pure and uncomplicated. "Brave is just another word for love," she said. "That's what Mama says. When you love someone enough, you can be brave for them." As the sun set over the terrace, casting golden light over the child and her stone castle, Alexander Thornton felt the second crack appear in his carefully constructed walls. And this time, he didn't try to repair it. The terrace became their daily meeting place. At first, Alexander told himself he was simply being courteous, that allowing a child to build castles on his property cost him nothing. But by the end of the second week, he found himself checking his watch at 4:30 p.m., anticipating her arrival with something that felt dangerously close to eagerness. Lily was a natural storyteller. Each day brought a new tale woven into her castle building: the princess who tamed dragons with kindness, the knight who won battles with words instead of swords, the queen who ruled with cookies and hugs. "Is that how you think kingdoms should work?" Alexander asked one afternoon, watching her place flower petals as flags on her stone towers. "It's how love works," Lily replied matter-of-factly. "And kingdoms should work like love. Everybody gets enough. Nobody gets left out in the cold." He found himself thinking about her words during board meetings, during negotiations, during the ruthless decisions that had built his empire. When had he started believing that business and humanity were incompatible? When had he accepted that success required coldness? One rainy Thursday, Lily arrived soaked to the bone, shivering but smiling. Elena had been delayed at the bus stop, and Lily had walked the last 3 blocks alone. "Good Lord, child," Alexander said, scooping her up without thinking another first. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. You're freezing. He carried her inside, ignoring Elena's shocked expression as he wrapped Lily in a blanket from the sitting room. Her small body trembled against his chest, and he felt a fierce protective instinct that terrified him with its intensity. I didn't want to miss castle time, Lily said through chattering teeth. We're building the Great Hall today, remember? The Great Hall can wait, he said firmly, surprising himself with the authority in his voice, the same tone he used to command executives, now deployed to convince a 3-year-old to prioritize her health. First, we get you warm. He made her hot chocolate himself, something he hadn't done since. He couldn't remember when. Elena hovered nervously, but he waved her back to her work. This felt important, personal. Lily's small hands wrapped around the mug, and she took a sip, her eyes closing in contentment. This tastes like Mama's, she said. Like love feels. How does love feel? He found himself asking. She thought for a moment, swinging her legs from the oversized chair. Warm. Safe. Like even if you're scared, you're not alone in the scary. Like someone's hand holding yours in the dark. Alexander sat across from her, watching steam rise from her mug. Have you been scared, Lily? Her expression grew serious, older than her years. When Daddy left, I was scared. Mama cried a lot. I thought maybe I did something wrong, that I was too loud or too much. But Mama held me every night and said love doesn't leave because of who you are. It leaves because of who people choose to be. And we choose to stay. The wisdom of it struck him silent. Here was a child who'd been abandoned, yet understood love better than most adults. Better than him. My parents fought, he heard himself say. Words he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. Constantly. Viciously. I learned to hide in my room, to make myself invisible. I thought if I was perfect enough, quiet enough, successful enough, maybe they'd stop. Maybe they'd notice me for the right reasons. Lily climbed down from her chair and walked to him, placing her small hand on his knee. Did they stop? No, he said. They divorced when I was 12. My father blamed me. Said I was the reason they'd stayed together so long. The reason they were so miserable. That's not true, Lily said with absolute certainty. Grown-ups' choices aren't because of kids. They're just because of grown-ups. Mama told me that 100 times. Alexander looked into her earnest face and felt something break open inside him. Not a crack this time, but a complete shattering. And with it came tears he hadn't allowed himself in 22 years. I'm sorry, he said, trying to turn away, but Lily climbed into his lap, uninvited, unafraid, and wrapped her small arms around his neck. It's okay to cry, she whispered. Tears are just love that's too big to stay inside. That's what Mama says when I miss Daddy. So Alexander Thornton, billionaire, business titan, man who'd never shown weakness in his life, held a 3-year-old child and wept. For his lonely childhood, for his grandmother, who'd been the only one who loved him, for all the years he'd spent building walls instead of bridges. Elena found them there an hour later, her daughter asleep in her employer's arms, his face peaceful in a way she'd never seen. She started to speak, to apologize, but he shook his head gently. Let her sleep, he whispered. Just a few more minutes. Because the truth was he needed these minutes too. Needed the weight of this small, trusting body against his chest. Needed the reminder that love existed, that it could be simple and uncomplicated and freely given without contracts or conditions. When Elena finally took Lily home that evening, the child still drowsy and wrapped in a blanket that cost more than her mother's monthly salary, Alexander stood at the window and watched them disappear into the dusk. His phone buzzed with urgent emails, with deals that needed closing, with the demands of an empire that had once defined him. But for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Thornton ignored them all. He walked to the terrace where Lily's stone castle stood in the fading light. She'd left a note under a rock, written in wobbly preschool letters. For Mr. Alex. Because you're not lonely anymore. Love, Lily. He picked up the note with shaking hands and carried it inside, placing it on his desk where contracts worth millions usually sat. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that everything was about to change. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Alexander started coming home earlier, found excuses to work from the estate instead of his downtown office. His assistant noticed, his business partners commented, but he offered no explanations. The truth was, he discovered something more valuable than any acquisition. He discovered that 4:30 to 6 p.m. had become the most important part of his day. Lily bloomed under the attention like a flower in sunlight. Her castles grew more elaborate, her stories more complex. But more than that, she started asking him to play other games, to read stories, to simply exist in her small world. "Mr. Alex, do you know how to have a tea party?" she asked one afternoon. "I've attended many," he said carefully, thinking of stuffy charity events. No, she giggled. "A real tea party, with pretend tea and bears and lots of cookies." So Alexander Thornton, who'd negotiated with heads of state, found himself sitting on the terrace floor having a tea party with a 3-year-old and an assortment of stuffed animals she'd brought from home. "Mr. Bear says you're very serious," Lily informed him, speaking in a gruff voice for the toy. "He wants to know if you ever laugh." "I laugh," Alexander protested, then realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd genuinely laughed. "Show me," Lily challenged. "I can't just laugh on command." "Why not?" Her logic was irrefutable. So he tried. It started forced, awkward, but then Lily started making silly faces, and the giggle that escaped him was real. Then she tickled Mr. Bear and made him drink his tea so fast it spilled everywhere, and Alexander found himself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in years. Elena heard it from the kitchen and had to steady herself against the counter. She'd worked for Alexander Thornton for months and had never heard him express joy. Now, through the window, she watched a billionaire sprawled on the terrace floor with her daughter, both of them laughing like children. But the moment that changed everything came on a Tuesday in November. Alexander was in his study when he heard the scream. "Hi," terrified, distinctly Lily's voice. He was running before he'd consciously registered moving, his heart hammering with primal fear. He found her in the garden, having wandered from the terrace. A snake, harmless, he'd later learn, but large and unexpected, had startled her. She stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, too afraid to move. "Don't move, sweetheart," he called, forcing his voice to stay calm even as panic clawed at his chest. "I'm coming." He walked slowly, deliberately, scooped her up and away from the snake in one fluid motion. She clung to him like a lifeline, her small body racked with sobs. "I've got you," he murmured, carrying her back to the house. "You're safe. I've got you." "I was so scared," she hiccuped against his shoulder. "I couldn't move. I thought. Sure, it's okay. You're safe now." He held her until the crying stopped, stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances. And somewhere in those moments, with her heart beating against his chest and her tears soaking his expensive shirt, Alexander Thornton fell completely, irrevocably in love. Not romantic love, God, no. This was something purer, fiercer. The love of a guardian, a protector. The love he'd never received from his own father and had never thought himself capable of giving. When Elena came running, summoned by another staff member, she found them in the sitting room. Lily was calm now, telling her mother about the brave rescue, her eyes shining with admiration as she looked at Alexander. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thornton," Elena began, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't apologize for her being a child. Don't apologize for her existing. I'm tired of everyone apologizing for taking up space in my life." Elena stared at him, something shifting in her expression. from employee to something more like equal, or at least potential ally. "Sir," she said carefully, "may I speak freely?"
Please.
"Lily talks about you constantly, about Mr. Alex and his sad eyes that are getting happier, about castle time and tea parties and how you're learning to smile. She's become attached to you." The unspoken warning hung in the air. Don't break her heart. "I know," Alexander said, meeting her eyes directly. "And I'd like to discuss something with you. Privately, when you have time." That evening, after Lily had gone home, Elena returned. Alexander had never felt nervous before a conversation, but his hands were sweating as he gestured for her to sit. "I want to set up a trust fund for Lily," he said without preamble. "For her education, her future. I've already spoken with my lawyers. She'll have access when she turns 18, but until then, it will cover any expenses, medical, educational, anything she needs." Elena's face went white. "Mr. Thornton, I can't accept." "You can and you will," he said firmly. "This isn't charity, Elena. This is investment. In a child who's teaching me to be human again. I'm not asking for anything in return. No obligations, no strings. Just let me do this one thing that actually matters." Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks. "Why?" she whispered. "You barely know us." "Because she waits," Alexander said simply. "Every single day, she waits faithfully. Because when I was cruel and cold, she saw something worth building castles for. Because she makes me want to be the man she thinks I am." Elena sobbed openly now, and Alexander awkwardly offered her his handkerchief, monogrammed, expensive, meaningless compared to the weight of the moment. "There's something else," he continued. "I'd like your permission to be present. In her life. Not as an employer, but as—" he struggled for the word. "As family, perhaps. If you'll allow it." Elena looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her making calculations. Risk versus trust. Fear versus hope. "She's already chosen you," Elena finally said. "From the first day at that gate, she's been choosing you. I think the question is whether you're choosing her back." "I am," Alexander said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm choosing both of you." That night, alone in his study, Alexander looked at the newest addition to his desk, a small stone castle, carefully constructed, with a note that read, "Home is where people wait for you. Love, Lily." And Alexander Thornton, who'd spent his adult life building an empire, realized he'd just found the only kingdom that mattered. 6 months later, the estate looked different. Not dramatically. Alexander hadn't suddenly transformed into someone unrecognizable, but there were changes. A swing set in the garden. A collection of children's books in the library. Finger paintings on the refrigerator that he refused to remove despite his housekeeper's protests. And at 4:30 p.m. every day, Alexander Thornton closed his laptop and went to wait on the terrace. Because that's what you did for people you loved, you waited. Lily was 4 now, grown tall enough that she had to stretch less to reach the gate latch. She ran to him every afternoon, her backpack bouncing, her face lighting up in a way that never failed to crack something open in his chest. "Mr. Alex. Mr. Alex. Guess what I learned today?" And he would listen, truly listen, as she explained preschool politics or the life cycle of butterflies, or why purple was objectively the best color, though she considered arguments for blue. Elena had gradually become something more than his maid. Not an employee, not quite a friend, but something in between, an ally, a partner in raising this extraordinary child. He'd increased her salary substantially over her protests. He'd helped her enroll in night classes to finish her degree. Not as charity, but as recognition that she deserved more than just survival. "You're spoiling us," she'd said one evening. "Good," he'd replied simply. The board meetings became easier after that. Whenever he felt himself slipping back into the cold calculation that had defined his first 34 years, he'd think of Lily's question, "Does your company have enough?" Or are you making people not have enough so you can have more? Out of the mouths of babes. He started restructuring his business practices, prioritizing employee welfare, sustainability, long-term community impact over short-term profit. His shareholders grumbled. He didn't care. He'd discovered something more valuable than their approval. One evening in spring, as sunset painted the terrace golden, Lily looked up from the castle she was building, a magnificent structure now, accumulated over months of daily additions. Mr. Alex, can I ask you something? Anything, sweetheart. Are you my family? The question stopped his heart. He set down his phone, giving her his complete attention, another skill she'd taught him. Do you want me to be? He asked carefully. She nodded seriously. Mama says family is who chooses to stay. And you stayed. Even when it was hard. Even when I was scared. Even when you were sad. Then yes, Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm your family. If you'll have me. Lily launched herself at him, and he caught her, held her, this small, fierce creature who'd stormed his defenses with nothing but stones and unwavering love. Does that mean you'll come to my school concert? She asked against his shoulder. Because Mama will be there, and we could all sit together. Like a real family. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The concert was everything a preschool performance should be. Chaotic, off-key, absolutely perfect. Alexander sat in a tiny chair meant for parents, Elena on one side, watching Lily sing about rainbows with more enthusiasm than accuracy. And when Lily spotted them in the audience, her face split into that sunrise smile, and she waved so vigorously she nearly fell off the risers. Alexander waved back, not caring that every other parent was staring at the billionaire whose face regularly graced business magazines, now sitting cross-legged in a preschool cafeteria. After the concert, Lily ran to them, and Elena lifted her up, and somehow Alexander's arms were around both of them. This small, imperfect, beautiful family they'd accidentally created. Did you see me? Lily demanded. Did you see me sing? You were magnificent, Alexander said, and meant it more than any compliment he'd ever given in a boardroom. The best singer there, Elena agreed, kissing her daughter's cheek. Lily looked between them, her expression suddenly solemn. I have 2 people now, she said. 2 people who choose to stay. That's more than lots of kids have. You have 2 people who love you, Alexander corrected gently. That's what staying means. Later, after dropping Elena and Lily at their apartment, a nicer place now, in a safer neighborhood, another change he'd insisted on, Alexander drove back to his estate. But instead of going inside, he walked to the terrace where the stone castle still stood, illuminated by carefully placed solar lights. It had become a permanent fixture, this monument to faithfulness. He'd had landscapers build around it, protecting it from weather, preserving every stone Lily had placed with such care. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Then he realized Elena had gotten Lily a phone for emergencies. The message was a voice recording. He pressed play. Hi, Mr. Alex. It's me, Lily. Mama helped me send this because I have something important to say. Thank you for being my family. Thank you for waiting with us. I love you to the moon and back and all around the stars. That's the biggest love there is. Good night. Alexander played it 3 more times, his vision blurring. He'd spent 34 years believing that love was a weakness, that attachment was a liability, that the only safe way to live was alone. He'd built his empire on that foundation, achieved everything society said mattered. But a 3-year-old girl standing at a gate, waiting with patient faith, had taught him the truth. Love wasn't something to be feared or avoided. Love was the only thing worth building at all. The next day, Alexander did something that shocked his entire legal team. He began the process of establishing Lily as his heir. Not officially an adoption. That would require more time, more legalities, and he didn't want to erase her father from her identity, even if he'd abandoned her. But in his will, in his estate planning, in every legal document that mattered, Lily Reyes was named as his daughter in all but blood. "Sir," his lawyer said carefully, "are you certain? This child, she's not related to you. You've known her less than a year." "I'm certain," Alexander replied. "She's taught me more about life in these months than I learned in the previous 34 years. That makes her family." When he told Elena, she cried. When he told Lily in simpler terms, "You'll always be taken care of, always be part of my family no matter what," she simply hugged him and said, "I know. That's what love does." Months became a year, then two. Alexander's life transformed in ways both subtle and profound. He still ran his company, still made millions, still commanded respect in boardrooms worldwide. But now he left sharp at 4:30. Now he carried pictures in his wallet. Now he knew every word to Let It Frozen because Lily had played it 1,000 times. On Lily's 6th birthday, he threw her a party at the estate, the first party those walls had seen in decades. Children ran screaming through gardens that had known only silence. Cake was eaten on furniture worth more than cars. And Alexander watched it all, with a joy he'd never known existed. "You're happy," Elena observed, standing beside him as they watched Lily open presents. "I am," he admitted. "Terrifyingly so." "Why terrifying?" "Because it means I have something to lose." He looked at Elena, then at Lily, surrounded by her friends. "Everything to lose. That's what makes it real," Elena said softly. "The risk. The choice to be vulnerable anyway." "When did you become so wise?" "When I became a mother. When I chose to love someone more than I feared being hurt." She paused. "She's changed you, you know. Lily, you're not the same man I started working for." "No," Alexander agreed. "I'm not. That man was half alive. This version might be Messier, but at least he's human." That night, after the guests had left and the caterers had cleaned up, the three of them sat on the terrace. Lily, exhausted from her party, dozed in Alexander's lap while Elena sat beside them, the three of them watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "This is my favorite place," Lily mumbled, half asleep. "Right here. With my family." "Mine too," Alexander whispered, surprising himself with the truth of it. Elena reached over, squeezed his hand once. A gesture of gratitude, of solidarity, of shared love for this remarkable child. And Alexander Thornton, who'd built his empire on being untouchable, squeezed back. Years later, when asked in an interview what his greatest achievement was, Alexander didn't mention his company, his wealth, or his influence. Instead, he pulled out his wallet and showed a worn photograph, a 3-year-old girl at a gate, hands wrapped around iron bars, looking at the camera with eyes full of hope. "This," he said simply, "the day I learned that the most important things in life wait patiently for you to notice them. That love isn't a weakness, it's the only strength that actually matters. That sometimes the smallest people carry the biggest wisdom." "That's your daughter?" the interviewer asked. Alexander smiled. The real smile he'd learned from a child who'd refused to give up on him. "That's the girl who saved my life," he corrected, "by standing at a gate and waiting for me to find my way home." And somewhere, in an estate transformed from a fortress into a home, a stone castle still stood on the terrace, a monument to a truth Alexander had learned from the most unlikely teacher. When you love someone, you wait. Even if it's cold, even if it's long, you wait. Because that's what family does. That's what love is.